I can tell you this, Andy Fecco is not only the go-to guy for water policy for my office, he's the go-to guy for other water agencies in our region. The first response I often get from those agencies is, well, what does PCWA think? So we would all do well to fall silent and listen to the testimony we're about to hear.
You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lamborn and Ranking Member Huffman, for having me here today, and thank you, Mr. McClintock, for that billing, which is going to be difficult to live up to. My name is Andrew Fecco. I serve as the Director of Resource Development for Placer County Water Agency. We are a publicly owned water agency in California's Gold Country, Mr. McClintock's district. We own and operate our own system, the Middle Fork Project, 2 major dams and reservoirs, 5 powerhouses, all owned by the people of Placer County. We serve water. We help the California electricity grid with renewable energy, and we do a really good job, I think, of balancing those needs. So I'm here today as in my capacity at PCWA. I'm also here as a member of the Federal Affairs Committee for the National Water Resources Association. What I'm going to say today, I think, is reflective of conditions throughout the West. It's particularly applicable to Northern California. And so I thought I'd start with some historical perspective and perhaps a little bit of a talk about weather. The Western United States is unique. It's unique because we go through drought and flood cycles like no other place in the United States. We've just endured perhaps one of the longer and one of the deeper droughts in recent memory, at least since the settlement of the West. And we are faced in 2017 with the opposite problem of too much water. And those two extremes are normal in the West. They are particularly acute, of course, in California. And it is the reason that the federal government, starting at the turn of the century and moving through to today, decided consciously to make an investment in water in the Western United States. Because the infrastructure you need to populate the Western United States is water storage. You've got to take water that falls into years like 2017 and store it, whether it's above ground or below ground, so that you can have farms, cities, and communities that survive the dry years. This is not new, and this is probably not news to this committee. The question is, how do we go from where we are today with the infrastructure that we have, and how do we take that infrastructure and integrate it and modernize it to serve the next generations of Californians and Westerners? I think that's the critical issue facing this committee. And I've heard a lot of good ideas already today. Let me focus on 3 things that I think that this committee can help with. The first is that infrastructure that the federal government built over the last 100 years in the West is getting old. And the needs for renewal and replacement of that infrastructure are great. And I will say this, water and power utilities throughout the West that rely on those projects are willing to pay for the upkeep of those projects. It takes some funding by Congress, and I think that funding comes back to you in the form of fees and charges from users. That is a well-understood system, and I think we need to carry that forward into the future so that we have properly operating federal infrastructure. Second, local agencies like mine, like Andy Colosimo's down here, we know what we're doing when it comes to serving our customers. We're very, very good at it. We can develop new infrastructure locally. Our ratepayers can help pay for it. But in many instances, when we gather together those utilities and we need large infrastructure built, it can be difficult to finance that. And so as we look throughout the West, large projects are part of our future, whether they're large groundwater storage projects. There are even large surface storage projects available to us in California that have, frankly, a low environmental impact and a high cost-benefit ratio. Sites Reservoir in Northern California, my agency is on the Joint Powers Authority for Sites Reservoir, is an excellent example. Locally driven project, many agencies involved, all chipping in. It is a project specifically designed to replace some of the yield that's been lost through the federal system over the years because this Congress and others have decided that we're going to reallocate some water to the environment and the ecosystem. Locals have taken it upon themselves to replace that lost yield. And I think that is a wave of the future, and I think there is a way for the federal government to help participate in those locally driven projects. lastly, I'm going to say something about species recovery in California. The ESA and in California, other laws are duplicative, sometimes repetitive, but they focus on single species management. And we think that the outcome of those single species management actions has not been to the interest of water users, nor to the interest of the species. We propose in the West, and I think California's particularly, a new way to do business under the ESA where we look at habitat level conservation to get better results, locally driven, at a very in a very cost-effective way. And we think that those kinds of issues and way of going about it will help us survive and increase yield going into the future. And I'm happy to talk about that more if you have a question.
Okay, thank you. And I think everyone here wants as much conservation as possible. But can conservation alone meet the West's current and future water needs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me use an analogy about conservation. A friend of mine told me that conservation is selling your car because you don't have enough money for fuel. And efficiency is getting a more fuel-efficient car and doing the same things you used to do in a more efficient way. Water use efficiency is a really good idea. And it means that our economies can still grow and that we can put waters to its highest, most beneficial use, another tenet of Western water law. Conservation is something that we reserve and we talk about in the West for times of drought. And we've just been through a time of drought in California. And we had to conserve water in many parts of the state to get through that. But I will say that as we continue our water efficiency efforts, making our customers and our businesses more water efficient, it's still not going to be enough to meet the future needs, especially in California as we continue to grow. If we want to grow communities and grow food in California, we have to increase our yield of water in the state. And in years like 2017, we have more yield than we know what to do with. And so the idea is to take years like 2017 and distribute the water into places where we can store it for the future.
Okay.
And that is a challenge that involves groundwater and surface water, all of those things, and it has to happen on a statewide basis.
Okay, appreciate the answer.
Thanks to all the witnesses for your testimony. It's a great conversation we're having. And Mr. Fecco, I did listen like E.F. Hutton and enjoyed your testimony very much. You didn't have a chance to talk about something that you and I have discussed in the past, and I think that you support, and that is forecast-informed reservoir operations. I wonder if you could very briefly just confirm whether you think this is a good idea that needs to be part of the conversation, and whether you think we should be operating our reservoirs based on the best available science today to make sure we're being efficient and smart with our water decisions.
First, I agree, and there's a second part. You have to have, in addition to forecast-based operations, the infrastructure in place necessary to maximize your water storage, but also make safe flood control releases. Right. Those two things must work hand in hand, or forecast-based operations don't work. And so at many places, Folsom's a great example. We have a joint federal project. Next year, I believe the project will be at a stage where we'll be able to use the new spillway. The flood diagram is being upgraded. It's an excellent multi-purpose project that we think is going to increase water yield. It's going to increase downstream safety for flood control. But it's two parts. It's knowledge and experience in operating it, but it's also the infrastructure part. And I think that that's a critical piece that we can't miss.
I appreciate that very much.
Because of transportation, we've been a donor state for a long time, and so we have built much of our highway system on tolls paid by the residents who live there. We have quite a few, not only wastewater, but water treatment plants and so forth, all of which are paid, the expansion or improvements or whatever are paid for by the customers of that particular authority or company. And I'm wondering, when we're talking about funding some of these things in California, is there a justification for the citizens in my area to pay for maybe projects in South California?
So let me try that on sort of the large infrastructure front. I mean, I think that what Congress found when we began reclaiming the West and building projects in the West was that it was in the national interest to develop economically in the West. And so Congress authorized projects, et cetera. And continues to own and operate those projects through appropriations that are paid back by the users. I think that a lot of the new generation of projects, because of funding limitations, are being carried by local citizens. And the way to grow the pie with the existing federal projects is integrating them with local projects. I mean, I think that that's where the Bureau of Reclamation can really help the Western United States more fully develop its water resources, is integrating those federal projects with these local projects that are coming online so that we do get to that all of the above strategy that the chairman talked about. I think that it remains to be seen whether there's going to be a new large federal water project in the West, but I do think that operating and maintaining what we already own works to the benefit of the national economy.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
We've had 5 years of drought now. It's brought billions of dollars of economic damage to our state. It's brought many of our communities within months of running out of water because we can't store sufficient supplies from wet years to guarantee supply in dry ones. And now that 5-year drought has been followed by record rains, and we're watching virtually all of that water lost because we don't have sufficient storage for the next drought. Mr. Fecko, the question I'd ask of you is, what are the biggest impediments that you face in meeting the needs of the communities you serve?
From the Northern California perspective, Mr. Congressman, your Sacramento analogy is a good one. We have, of course, Sites Reservoir in the planning stages for now 2 decades. The Shasta Reservoir enlargement, about the same. It takes an extraordinarily long amount of time in the federal system to get through those planning processes.
And costs, I would imagine.
It does. Mostly been borne by the taxpayer at this point. I think that what we've found with Sites Reservoir is the locals actually taking that project on themselves. We are much more expeditiously able to move through the planning process. Rather than opening a book and staring at blank pages and inventing stuff, the local folks know what the needs are, and we're going to design a project and go through the environmental review. We'll go through all the proper channels. It will still take time and money to do, but I think
so what can we do to get the federal government out of the way so that you can do your job to serve the water needs of your communities?
I think direction to the Bureau of Reclamation and to the regulatory agencies to be much more efficient about how they apply federal law and how they work with local agencies. You have to have a champion. I mean, the federal government has to be a champion for these projects. If they're not a champion, they go nowhere. And so I think that it really does take leadership at both the regulatory agencies and at the project agencies like the Bureau.
The good news is they're about to come under new management, but also, you know, it's our responsibility to change the law so that this kind of foolishness doesn't imperil our communities and our economy ever again.
It takes streamlining the approval process because, as Mr. Colosimo said, time is money in these cases, and every year you spend planning is a year of money that's behind you.
Now, the planet has been warming on and off since the last ice age. It's been warming steadily since the end of what they call the Little Ice Age that ended at the beginning of the 19th century. Isn't it logical that if we can't store as much water in snowpacks, we ought to be adding to our surface storage?
Yeah, that's exactly the strategy that many agencies in California are taking, both in groundwater storage and in surface water storage. And to be clear, whether it's climate change or whether it's just the hydrology of California, you have to store water when it's raining and use it when it's dry, and it doesn't matter if it's going to be warmer or wetter or warmer and drier in the future.
Final question of yes. How much do environmental regulations add to the typical cost of a project?
Well, for instance, in our relicensing effort of our Middle Fork project, it was a decade-long process, 275 plus public meetings. We spent almost $37 million to relicense our Middle Fork project.
And who pays that?
My ratepayers pay that.
Mr. Fecko, good morning. What would be the top 5 projects for you, in your opinion, in Northern California?
It's an excellent question. 2 things. The Sites Reservoir project, I think, is an excellent project, long overdue. Off-stream, low impact from an ecosystem perspective and actually helps Shasta and Oroville run more efficiently. So using Sites Reservoir, because it's off stream, by the way, we could have stored almost 1 million acre-feet this year as it's been wet, to serve agricultural and municipal demands, allows more water to be stored in Shasta and Oroville. Increasing the cold water pool in those places actually helps the salmon fishery, right? So in my mind, Sites is a top project. When you marry Sites and other surface storage projects with groundwater storage projects, groundwater banking projects, we have one in the Sacramento area, that's your savings account, right? So when you're using surface water when it's wet, your groundwater is recharging itself naturally in an in-lieu sort of way. You can access that water when you need to in the dry years. It is literally your savings account when you have those drought times. So groundwater banking, excellent. I think we have a project called the River Arc Project that reduces our reliance on Folsom Reservoir in the Sacramento region, takes pressure off of that system, particularly in dry years. Again, another excellent project. I think that those kinds of things, integrated surface storage, groundwater storage projects, and the interconnections that make those work, so taking groundwater agencies and hooking them to surface water and vice versa, that's going to be the top priority to really get us through these next decades.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you again to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We've been trying to do more and more on environmental streamlining. Certainly more is needed. But we're also looking at ways to reduce the cost of capital and begin building new storage. We have looked at federal-backed financing programs like TIFIA and WIFIA as being options. Do you think tools like these through reclamation states, and through reclamation itself would be helpful in modernizing our water and power infrastructure? Mr. Fecko, why don't you go first?
In my capacity as helping the Sites Joint Powers Authority, we've looked at this because, again, this is a Sites Reservoir is a $4.5 billion project in that neighborhood, being funded by local agencies, and so it is clearly an expensive piece of infrastructure to build. We've estimated that if we can access some of these federal financing tools, we could save up to 15 to 20% on each acre-foot of delivered water from that project. So cost of water goes from something like perhaps $600 an acre-foot to something like $500 an acre-foot, and that's simply a savings from financing charges, right? And so that's a benefit. That's a way to spur local and to help local agencies build a project in the West without having direct federal appropriations or having the Bureau of Reclamation own and operate the facility. It just helps us build it.
And TIFIA and WIFIA have both have about a 35-year payback with an additional 5-year option on the completion of the project. With a longer repayment period and the ability to defer the initiation of repayment, help you not only with the state water bond, but ultimately having a structure available with a long payment plan.
Yeah, absolutely. We're a startup, right? We're an amalgamation of local agencies. There's something like 20 of us that are trying to fund this project. And so when you're a startup, capital and cash flow are problems, right? And so having options like this to delay first payments and then have a longer payback term really makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of letting an agency like ours that's new get its feet on the ground. I will say that projects, public works projects where public agencies are involved have a significantly low rate of default. There really is very little risk in these programs when local agencies are the ones doing the work.
Thank you. And just one final question. I've got a bill, HR 434, the New Water Act, another similar program, a pilot project. I'd certainly like to see TIFIA and WIFIA used more to unleash that capital, but setting up a new Water Act as well provides one more option. And have you looked at the new Water Act, and is that something that would be helpful as well?
Yeah, these tools, some tools fit some projects better than others, right? And clearly there's a suite of federal help out there already. I think that I've heard discussions of simplifying that and really focusing that into a smaller number of programs. But all of those options work for different things. Some of them work well for recycled water. Some of them work for these big infrastructure projects. And so all of those tools will be helpful to places like California and places like Colorado and other parts of the West. Absolutely.
Well, there's certainly an immediate need. I mean, you're seeing the challenges with Orville. We've got sites, Temperance Flat. There are a number of different opportunities just in California alone. Obviously, there are more of those opportunities across the nation. Just on the pilot project itself, where do you recommend that we provide the funding to start the program up? Any ideas?
You know, in my view, getting capital moving through somehow providing some way of backing these loans, I think that's really a good use of startup money in that framework, because it leverages many times over in the local districts. We can take that funding and turn, you know, $100 million into billions of dollars out in the field, because really what you're helping us with is that gap insurance at the back end. So I think that's a great use of capital to start up a bank like that.
Mr. Fecko, let me just start with you with this. You're certainly no stranger to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's my understanding that a lot of these hydroelectric companies lose roughly 5% just in the relicensing. I mean, this is just, to me, an obscene reality of tens of millions of dollars potentially that, I mean, this is critical to the needs of our community, providing services, electricity and so forth. So how can this process, the relicensing process, be improved?
So it's an excellent question. It's one we've been tackling for the last 10 years. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. Again, back to the time is money theme, right? The time you spend in relicensing these federal projects, which for us was a decade, and I mentioned cost $37 million, that's a hit in and of itself, right? Because you have to pay that bill up front. But then the conditions that come on later as you implement those licenses are also costs. In between, for instance, in our situation, we have a settlement agreement. All the parties agree that we should be getting a new license. We reached that agreement in 2013, actually in 2012. And we've been waiting ever since for a license to be issued. And that's because of the sort of disaggregated nature of decision-making in that process. The state of California has a role, each federal agency has a role, FERC has a role, and everybody sort of, even when you have a deal, it takes a long, long time to get the deal through. And so we have now delayed construction of infrastructure projects to help us mitigate that loss that you talked about, that 5% loss. We have projects that we can do to help mitigate that and still provide ecosystem benefits, but we just simply can't get our license. So again, time is money. These things are waiting to happen. We could put capital to work.
So we're on this. This is obviously an issue that needs to be corrected.
I would strongly suggest that the committee of record on this really take this up again in the new Congress.